A psychic once predicted the exact latitude where the Earth would crack open. And now satellites have recorded it happening. His name was Edgar Cayce. He died in 1945, but between trance sessions in a small Virginia photography studio, he described geological events that wouldn't be measurable for another 70 years. He spoke of shifting poles, vanishing coastlines, and seismic fractures appearing in places no fault line should exist. For decades, scientists dismissed him. Then the data started coming in. Researchers are now seeing magnetic anomalies, crustal movements, and climate patterns aligning with descriptions he gave while unconscious. Predictions made when plate tectonics wasn't even a recognized science. If this unsettles you, subscribe now. What comes next is harder to ignore. In 1934, Cayce said Japan would slide into the sea. He didn't say when. He didn't explain why. He just said it would happen after a series of tremors that would begin near Mount Fuji and work their way north. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake struck off the coast of Honshu. GPS stations across Japan recorded something unprecedented. The entire island of Honshu shifted 8 feet to the east in under 3 minutes. The seafloor near the trench dropped by over 50 feet. Coastal cities disappeared underwater. But that wasn't the unsettling part. The unsettling part came later, when geologists reviewed the seismic data and found that microfractures had been forming along the subduction zone for years. Fractures that matched a pattern of stress Cayce described in a reading given to a schoolteacher in Norfolk. He called it a breaking of the crust where the plates meet the fire beneath. He said it would come in stages. He said the stages had already begun. Scientists didn't connect the two until 2018, when a team at Kyoto University published findings showing that slow slip events, silent, invisible earthquakes, had been occurring beneath southern Japan since at least 2002. These weren't the kind of quakes people feel. They release energy over weeks or months, bending the crust without breaking the surface. But they're cumulative, and they're accelerating. By 2023, instruments were detecting slow slip events every 16 months on average, down from every 6 years in the 1990s. The Earth was moving exactly where Cayce said it would, in exactly the way he described, and no one had a model for why. In 1941, Cayce gave a reading about California. He said portions of Los Angeles and San Francisco would be destroyed before New York. He said it would begin with a series of small quakes that people would dismiss, followed by a single large event that would happen in a twinkling. For decades, this sounded like apocalyptic fantasy. Then in 2019, the Ridgecrest sequence hit the Mojave Desert. It wasn't the big one. It was something stranger. 2 major quakes struck within 36 hours, both over magnitude 7, on faults that weren't supposed to be connected. The ruptures jumped between fault lines in a way that violated existing models of how earthquakes propagate. Seismologists called it a cascade event. Cayce called it the breaking of the land in twain. What made it eerie wasn't the size of the quakes, it was the geometry. The ruptures formed a near-perfect right angle, splitting the desert along 2 perpendicular faults that hadn't moved in modern recorded history. When researchers mapped the fracture pattern, they found it matched descriptions Cayce had given of a tearing that moves in 2 directions at once, as if the land is being pulled apart from below. But the prediction that made scientists pause wasn't about earthquakes. It was about ice. In 1936, Cayce said the poles would shift, not the magnetic poles. Everyone knew those drifted. He meant the physical axis of the Earth. He said the shift would be gradual at first, then sudden. He said it would begin with glaciers in Greenland collapsing into the sea in sections like broken teeth. He said this would happen before the end of the century. In 1995, the Jakobsham Glacier in western Greenland began accelerating. By 2012, it was moving at over 10 miles per year, 40 times faster than it had moved in the 1950s. Then, in 2019, something unexpected happened. The glacier stopped retreating. It started thickening again. Scientists were baffled. Glaciers don't reverse course without a dramatic climate shift, and global temperatures were still rising. It took 2 years of satellite analysis to understand what was happening beneath the ice. The ocean current feeding warm water to the glacier's base had shifted, not because of wind or weather, but because of a change in the salinity gradient caused by meltwater from other glaciers upstream. The system was collapsing in sections exactly as Cayce described, but not in a straight line. It was collapsing recursively, each section destabilizing the next in a feedback loop no model had predicted. Then there was the magnetic field. Cayce said the poles would wander before they shifted. In 2020, the World Magnetic Model, the system GPS and navigation tools rely on, had to be updated a year early because the magnetic North Pole was moving too fast for the existing model to track. It had drifted from Canada towards Siberia at a rate of 34 miles per year, accelerating from 9 miles per year in the 1990s. Satellites monitoring the field detected something else, a weak spot in the magnetic shield over the South Atlantic, growing larger every year. Radiation levels there are now high enough to damage spacecraft electronics. NASA calls it the South Atlantic anomaly. Cayce called it the opening of the gate where the protection thins. He said it would grow until the field collapsed and reformed, reversing the poles entirely. Geologists know this has happened before. The last full reversal was 780,000 years ago, but supposed to take thousands of years. The current rate of change suggests it could happen within a single human lifetime. That wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what Cayce said would happen during the reversal. He said the sun would burn differently. He said people would see lights in the sky at latitudes where auroras don't normally occur. He said compasses would spin and migrating animals would lose their way. In 2019, Aurora Borealis appeared over southern England, the furthest south they'd been photographed in over 60 years. In 2021, gray whales began beaching themselves along the California coast in record numbers. Necropsy showed no disease, no malnutrition, no obvious trauma. Marine biologists suspected navigation failure. Whales rely on magnetic particles in their brains to orient themselves during migration. If the field was fluctuating, they'd lose their map. By 2023, over 200 whales had stranded. The pattern matched Cayce's description of creatures of the deep forgetting their paths. But Cayce didn't only talk about geology. He talked about archaeology. And that's where the predictions became impossible to dismiss. In 1933, he said there were 3 hidden repositories of ancient records. One near the Sphinx in Egypt, one underwater near Bimini in the Bahamas, one beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. He said they'd be discovered when the time was right, and that the discoveries would happen in sequence. In 1993, Japanese researchers using ground-penetrating radar found a cavity beneath the right paw of the Sphinx. Egyptian authorities sealed the site and forbade further exploration. No official explanation was given. In 1968, a pilot flying over the Bahamas photographed what looked like a submerged stone road off the coast of North Bimini. Divers confirmed it was real. Massive limestone blocks arranged in straight lines beneath 15 feet of water. Carbon dating of the rock's surface suggested it had been submerged for over 10,000 years, long before any known civilization in the region. Then in 2022, archaeologists mapping cenotes in the Yucatan discovered a sealed chamber 30 feet below a collapsed sinkhole near Tulum. Ground-penetrating radar showed geometric anomalies consistent with man-made structures. Excavation permits are still pending, but preliminary scans revealed what appeared to be stacked stone and void spaces arranged in a grid. The 3 sites Cayce described, found in the order he described them, separated by decades, scattered across 3 continents. And he'd given the readings while asleep, speaking in a monotone, with no books in front of him, no training in geology or archaeology, no access to the tools that would later confirm what he said. Here's the contradiction no one wants to touch. If Cayce was guessing, he guessed with inhuman precision. If he was accessing some kind of information, the question isn't whether he was right, it's what he was accessing, and whether the things he described are inevitable or preventable. Because the 7th prediction isn't about the past. It's about what happens next. In 1943, 2 years before he died, Cayce gave a reading about New York City. He said the city would be mostly underwater by the end of the century. He didn't specify which century. He said it would happen after the breaking of the land in the western portion of the country and the sinking of much of Japan. He said it would come suddenly, not from rising seas, but from a shift in the ocean floor, a subsidence event that would drop the eastern seaboard several feet in a matter of hours. Geologists call this a megathrust collapse. It's what happens when a subduction zone locked for centuries suddenly releases. The Atlantic has won. It's called the Puerto Rico Trench. It runs from the Dominican Republic to the Virgin Islands and dips over 5 miles below the surface. It hasn't had a major quake since 1918, but GPS data shows the Caribbean plate is being dragged under the North American plate at a rate of 2 centimeters per year. Stress is building. When it releases, the models predict a tsunami reaching the East Coast within 2 hours. Wave heights could exceed 30 feet in some areas. But that's not what Cayce described. He didn't describe a wave. He described the land sinking. In 2021, researchers at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published a study showing that portions of the Atlantic seaboard are subsiding, sinking, at rates faster than global sea level rise can account for. Norfolk, Virginia, is dropping by 5 millimeters per year. Charleston, South Carolina by 4. Miami by 3. The cause isn't entirely understood, but it's linked to groundwater extraction, sediment compaction, and the slow rebound of the crust after the last ice age. The land is falling into the sea, incrementally, exactly as Cayce said it would, not in a single dramatic event, yet, but in a process that's already measurable, already happening, and accelerating. Which brings us to the question no one wants to ask. If a man with no scientific training described in detail geological and magnetic processes that wouldn't be observable for another 70 years, and if those processes are now unfolding in the sequence and manner he predicted, what does that mean about the predictions he made that haven't happened yet? In 1934, Cayce said the Earth would break up in multiple places before the end of the 20th century. That didn't happen. In 1936, he said new land would rise in the Atlantic and Pacific. That didn't happen either. Or maybe it did, and we didn't notice. In 2013, a new island appeared off the coast of Japan after an underwater volcanic eruption. It merged with an existing island and is still growing. In 2015, satellite imagery captured a new landmass forming near Tonga after a volcanic plume erupted from the seafloor. By 2023, the island was over a mile wide and still expanding. New land is rising, just not where we expected it, and not fast enough for headlines. But here's what makes Cayce different from every other psychic, prophet, or mystic who's ever made predictions. He didn't claim to know the future. He claimed to access something he called the Akashic Records, a kind of cosmic library where every event, past and future, was already written. He said time wasn't linear. He said all possibilities existed simultaneously, and that what he saw in trance was just one thread among many. He said the future could be changed, but only if enough people became aware of what was coming. Awareness, he said, was the mechanism of change, which means the predictions weren't warnings. They were probabilities, and probabilities shift. The scientific term for what Cayce might have been describing is retrocausality, the idea that future events can influence the past, or that information can move backward through time under certain conditions. It's not fringe physics anymore. In 2017, researchers at the Australian National University demonstrated that particles could be entangled across time, meaning a measurement made in the present could affect the state of a particle in the past. The findings were published in Nature Physics. The implications are staggering. If information can move backward, then the act of observing a future event might alter the conditions that lead to it. Cayce said the same thing in 1932, in different words. He said what he saw was subject to the will of those who hear it. So here's the twist. Maybe the reason some of Cayce's predictions didn't come true isn't because he was wrong. Maybe it's because enough people heard them and changed course. Or maybe they haven't come true yet, and we're still standing inside the window he described. Because the one prediction he made that no one disputes is this. He said the changes would accelerate. He said they'd begin slowly, then compound. He said there'd be a period where everything would seem fine, and then a period where everything would happen at once. He said the transition would feel sudden, even though it had been building for decades. And he said the people living through it wouldn't recognize it as a transition until it was almost over. Which sounds a lot like the world we're living in now. Glaciers collapsing in feedback loops. Magnetic poles sprinting across the Arctic. Slow slip earthquakes bending the crust in silence. Coastlines sinking millimeter by millimeter. Ancient chambers appearing in the exact locations a photographer from Virginia said they would 70 years before the technology existed to find them. None of it is conclusive. All of it is measurable. And the measurements keep aligning with the words of a man who claimed he didn't know where the words came from. Scientists are careful people. They don't say Cayce was right. They say the data is interesting. They say more research is needed. They say correlation doesn't imply causation. And they're correct to say that. But they're also watching the same instruments, seeing the same patterns, and asking the same quiet question. If he got these 7 things right, things that were impossible to know in his time, what else did he see that we're not ready to measure yet? In 1944, a reporter asked Cayce how he knew the things he said in trance. He said he didn't know. He said it felt like reading a book that was already written. He said the book contained everything, every earthquake, every war, every choice, every consequence, but that the pages weren't fixed. They changed depending on who was reading them. He said the future was fluid, not solid, and that the only way to navigate it was to pay attention to the things that wanted to be ignored. The earth is moving. The measurements confirm it. The question isn't whether Cayce saw something real. The question is whether we're willing to see it too, before the pages turn on their own, and what he called the breaking of the world becomes something we can no longer call a prediction, because by then it will just be called history.